Everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today I'm sharing my journey of the ups and downs of different stenciling techniques. You know how it goes. The ideas in our heads don't always translate to paper. Well, that was definitely my experience this week. But I pushed through and I ended up with 7 fun and thoughtful Valentine's cards. So join me as I reveal those and also provide some tips and tricks along the ways to avoid the pitfalls that I made. For this first technique, I am taking my rock candy glitter and I'm tinting it with alcohol ink, and I'm using 2 drops of fuchsia, and I'm just putting that in a small amount of that with a small amount of rock candy and stirring that up with a paintbrush stick until I can get all of the clumps out. It's really pivotal to get all of those clumps out. Once you get that done, the alcohol ink will dry very quickly. My goal here was to then take my stencil and brayer and use collage medium to use that as my adhesive. The problem is when I opened it up, it had separated, and this is where I run into my first problem. It was incredibly loose, and I could not get it to thicken up. So when I pour this out, you'll see that how loose it is. It's way looser than Mod Podge or anything else. It was quite watery, and that was going to cause several problems for the techniques that I had in mind for this rock candy. I went ahead and tried to use that brayer to get it an even coat, but because it was so watery, it just seeped right through. So it was time to pivot, and I decided to experiment with texture paste. Now, normally I wouldn't use texture paste as an adhesive, but it was the only thing that I had that, as I looked through my stash, that would be thick enough to use in a stencil format, but be able to hold that, at least I had hoped, that glitter. I sprinkled it on, and once I had a good coverage of it, I pressed it into into those hearts to hopefully get enough of an imprint or an impression into it that it would stay. Now, I will tell you that it worked, but if you were to actively rub it with each of the hearts with your finger, it would come off. Any other way, it holds, but again, if you were purposely trying to take it off with your finger, you could easily do that. For the second technique, I wanted to try Pink and Main's flock. And so using the color cotton candy, I decided that since I was having problems with the adhesive, that I would try texture paste for the flock. And I will tell you right now that this first one does not come out. I pressed it in. Once I sprinkled it over, I pressed it in with the back of the bottle to kind of press it in and make sure that it would essentially have that impression that I was trying to get with the rock candy. That seemed to work. It did not. And so I had to pivot once again. And this time I decided to use something that I know that works with other types of flock, or at least flock sheets. And that is the Decofoil's Transfer Gel Duo. Now, I used this before to show you how you could use a stencil to then create foiling techniques, and that worked perfectly. So using the same process as before, I put on the gel, sprinkled on the flock, and again using the back of the container, because I just emptied the whole bottle, and using the back of the container, I pressed that into those little hearts, hopefully providing enough of an imprint to get it to adhere. I went ahead and let that dry with the material still on it. And about a half hour later or so, I came in and emptied it off, and it showed it worked. And again, if you were to actively rub it off, it would come off, but any other handling of the card, it stays, and it's got a nice little cute fuzzy feel for all of the little hearts. Now, for the next set of problems that I run into, I believe this is mostly user error. I did not have a lot of reviews that I could find on this new product by Lisa Horton, and it's a wax that has this beautiful shimmer to it. But I wanted to use it in a stencil format with this bright cardstock, which is Dragon Fruit by C9, by the way, that I used in every card that I made. The problem with it is to get it to show through, I applied a heavy amount of it. And that is not what that product is for. And I learned this through trial and error, that it is on a stencil, it is likely to build up on the edges. And so you can see with this first attempt how it's thick in parts. I had let just too much product onto this. I thought, well, because it came out, it was quite beautiful, but I thought, yeah, I should probably heat set it to see if that would get that wax to dry thoroughly. So that's what I'm doing right here, just doing a light layer of heat, and then I put that off to the side. And without waiting and testing that product, I jumped right into using it again. And my goal here with the second attempt was to use this is Christina Werner's plaid builder, and I wanted to. It was the first time I was using this stencil, which I love the plaid technique. It came across quite lovely, but when I went to add this wax, and I was trying to use a lighter layer than I had before, I still found that with that sponge, it would cake up on the sides. So I ended up with a very uneven coat, as you can see here. And so I decided to play around with this a little bit better, get a feel for it. And you can see here that if you use just a light coat, I would not recommend a stencil, because it does want to adhere or pile up into the corners of the stencil or the edges. It's a very lovely product, and in fact, with this next technique that I'm using, which is a dry emboss technique, this is the Quirky stencil from C9 as well, and this comes out really easy if you've never done a dry emboss technique. It's just using your stencil and not actually applying any product on it. You're just actually creating the embossing of it. And so it looks like you had ran it through an embossing folder instead of a stencil. And this is the Quirky stripe. I love this stencil. I use it all of the time. But what I did for this card is that I used just a little light hand to go around the edges with that leftover sponge on that with the wax on it. And I did that also for the flower that I put on top, and you'll see that in here in a minute. But that worked. The other two with the thick layer did not. And so I'll show that in a minute on how I corrected that problem. But for now, I'm using another C9. This is a turnabout. If you've never used a turnabout stencil, I find the best way to do it is in my MISTI and using that corner, and you just simply rotate the stencil. So I'm using dragon fruit, which is the same color that I used for the cardstock. I also used eggplant and midnight. I only did 3 turns of the stencil and opted to stop there. But of course, I ran into problems with this one as well, because a product that I use all the time, which is my shimmer, it's called Sheer Shimmer Craft Spray. Never had a problem with it before. Sprayed it on when I was done taking this video footage, and it piled up. It took all of that blue and just muddied it up. So I had to do some fixing to that problem as well. But of course, the biggest problem I ran into was the issue of the gold. And it was just so thick, it was rubbing off. If I wanted to use these, the only choice that I had was to go ahead and take a cloth and rub off anything that was coming off. It definitely created a smearing effect, especially on that card. So I was frustrated, but I decided that that's where I would stop, and the next morning I would do the actual card making. So that's where we are here. I'm just putting together these cards quite quickly. I had already done the die cutting the day before, and so it was just a matter of putting things together. Now, as I mentioned, texture paste is not an adhesive, and so this looks great, I think, but if you really wanted to rub off that rock candy, you could do so with just a little bit of pressure. Now, this card was the failed attempt to adhere the flocking. So now it's just texture paste in a gloss, and so it was perfectly good, so I decided to continue with it and build a card. So for this card, I'm using C9 cardstock in peacock, dragon fruit, and carnation. And the flower comes from C9 as well, and that's from the Primrose Garden die set. Card number 3 is the flocking, and this is the flocking that worked. So I'm just adhering that. I used an elongated oval. The sentiment that I use also comes from that Primrose Garden die set, but the flowers come from Spellbinder's Big Bold Blooms. And I cut all of those out in various scraps, so I don't know all of the colors that I've used here, but the way that I adhere any kind of flower stacking is I start with randomly putting out kind of the base of the flowers, or the base of the leaves, I should say, that I want to show where essentially my boundaries are going to be. And then from there, I add the secondary flowers, and then I save the focal point flowers to last. Now, sometimes I use the sentiment and I adhere that last, but because I was trying to actually cover up one of the hearts that didn't have flock on it, that was just pure error on my part, I was covering that up. So I purposely put the sentiment there, and then I built around it. Cute card though. For card number 4, I'm using the Arched Dies and the Gerber Daisies from Spellbinders. The gold cardstock comes from Tonic, and the color is Honey Gold. It's a nice satin finish. And so now I'm just going to use those leaves and the flowers to help eliminate any other problematic spots. And there is one spot that's still visible that is bothering me, but when my husband saw the cards laid out, he pointed out that card as liking that one the most. So I think that that also is a reminder to us crafters that we see the problem areas more so than the recipient typically does. But who knows, I may come back and add an additional leaf in that lower right hand corner. By the way, the sentiment comes from Sneaking a Kiss die from also from Spellbinders. For card number 5, that also has that gold wax. I didn't use as much for this one, and so it's less problematic than the previous one, but it's still smeared enough in a few parts that I needed to help hide that or camouflage it. And so I did that with a large heart also cut out in Dragon Fruit C9. And this is a sentiment that comes from Christina Werner. This was the only card that I thought about adding embellishments to. But when you tilt it and you see that flash of gold, I think that that's enough, and that's why I didn't add it. If I do add embellishments to any of these cards, it'd be this one. Now, for card number 6, this one I went with a very monochromatic look, and this is using the embossed folder technique or the dry embossing technique using the quirky stencil from C9. And so what I'm doing right now is this is from Tonic as well, and I'm just taking the sentiment and I'm stacking it up in 3 different layers just to give it some bulk because I am using that monochromatic look, and you want it to have that elevation so that your eye can read it. For this card, I used what was left on the sponge applicator to go around the edges of the card as well as the center of the Gerber Daisy. And you can tell the shimmer, especially up close. It's not necessarily as clear as it is on camera, but it shows that this product is better used as an embellishment rather than a technique. And I think that that's where I went wrong. It needs to be very, very subtle. It needs to be very, very light-handed. And it provides that shimmer effect. But again, use it as an embellishment, not a technique. Now for this final card, I mentioned that I ran into some problems adding a shimmer spray to the polka dotted background. And because it had pooled up, the ink it just got too wet and the ink wasn't dry, and so it had that muddy feel. So I took a tissue, I wiped up what I could, and then I ended up die cutting it in a smaller size just so I could get rid of the edges that had most of the pooling. So it's a little bit faded. The shimmer is still there. So I'm just going to add my sentiment and I had some leftover leaves from the Gerber daisies that I'm using, and then the flowers come from that same Spellbinders Be Bold Blooms die set. Well, I certainly encountered a few hiccups this week. For a while there, it felt like I was battling my supplies. But guess what? I didn't let that stop me, and instead I learned, I adapted, and I ultimately created 7 cards. So whether you're a seasoned crafter or just starting out, I hope my experiences inspire you to keep pushing through those crafting challenges. Thank you for watching, and be sure to give a like and subscribe if you haven't already. What are you waiting for? It's free.